This session is part of the 7th Plural Positivity World Conference. Want to ask your questions to the presenters? Join us May 24th and 25 live in Airmeet for exclusive Q&As and connection. Use code PPWC25 for 25% off. Link in the description. Welcome many and everyone to this session of the 7th edition of the Plural Positivity World Conference. This session is presented by Abadi et al., covering important and sensitive topics including brief mentions of gatekeeping plural identity and experiences, and stigma against plurals and dissociatives. Brief and general mentions of oppression against plurals, dissociatives, mad, and queer people. Extremely brief mentions of abuse and unsafe living environments, but no details are provided. Please remember to prioritize your self-care during this session. You're encouraged to take breaks whenever needed and honor your collective emotional well-being. If you have questions for the presenter, please share them under the Questions tab so they can be addressed during the live Q&A. Afterward, we warmly invite you to visit this presenter's booth, where you'll find helpful PDFs and additional free resources. Now, without further ado, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce our wonderful presenter to you all. Here's Abadi et al.
Hello, everyone, and many. We're Abadi et al., a plural collective from the United States, and the founders and organizers of DMV Plurals. Today, we're going to be talking to you about how we think the plural community needs to move forward and why it matters, and we'll be sharing some concrete actions you can take to make it happen. Crow, TW, and Riley will all take turns speaking. As a content note, we will be discussing issues that affect the plural community, including gatekeeping of plural identity and experiences, stigma against plurals and dissociatives, oppression against plurals, dissociatives, mad and queer people, and extremely brief mentions of abuse and unsafe living environments with no details provided. These will generally be brief and non-specific mentions, but it is impossible to talk about the plural movement without talking about the obstacles it faces. This session is being recorded, so if you need to take a break at any time, we promise that you can come back to it later. Take care of yourselves. We will also be citing a couple of papers in this session. They'll pop up in the corner of the screen as we reference them, and they'll all be collated on a slide at the end or in the description box if you're seeing this on YouTube. Finally, we want to provide the disclaimer that we are American, and specifically Americans living in a major metropolitan area. We only know what it's like to organize here. We will try to keep things broadly applicable, but as we discuss later, we strongly encourage you to take your own environments into account before taking any of our advice. Now, I'm Crow VC, the ampersand is silent, my pronouns are Faye, Fair, and it's, and I'd like to introduce you to, well, this session. One of our pet projects for a while has been DMV Plurals, a meetup and online community group for plural folk in DC, Maryland, and Virginia, and more broadly, getting plural people to exist in in-person spaces more often for a number of reasons. The main one is that seeing plurals in person does infinitely more to break down stigma than basically anything else. Letters, video essays, and even conference talks like this one pale in comparison. This includes inter-community stigma, such as stigma from singlets towards multiples, and intra-community stigma, such as stigma from dissociative plurals towards non-dissociative plurals. We firmly believe that a large portion of the plural community's woes and stagnation comes from the fact that most of its members simply have not existed as plural in the real world or seen other plurals in the real world. This makes it a lot easier to assume that things like respectability politics, or the idea that seeming normal and respectable to outsiders, are vital to survival, and that everyone who disagrees with you is malicious and deserves no compassion or respect. Both ideas are false, and both are massively combated by just seeing other kinds of plural people and not being unkind or aggressive to them. And, processing them as real people who also exist. By seeing, we don't just mean on video or social media. Many have called the plural movement and subculture a niche and online phenomenon, and while we don't agree with this characterization, it didn't come from nowhere. Being out in person as plural is not only considered rare within the community, but it's often actively discouraged. It is quite uncommon for plurals to be out in their daily lives, especially due to concerns about stigma, discrimination, and oppression. Many plural activists are openly plural in their daily lives, but even among those who are, not many talk about what being casually open to strangers might mean. And among those few who do talk about what being out as plural is like, even fewer talk about being in community with other plural people offline. In our research, we found virtually no offline meetups or spaces for plural people in the entire English-speaking world that were not exclusive DID support groups, something that does not hold true for many similar minorities, such as otherkin, people who hear voices, trans people, and autistics. Many of the groups that may exist are likely to be private or semi-private, but it's still a quite stark contrast. Plural folks also want in-person and local communities, but we tend to be quite defeatist about the prospect of them. We often hear it spoken about as an impossibility or something we need to wait for permission from society to do. In a dissertation published in 2024, which interviewed many plural folks, many respondents expressed the belief that we could only have local communities if society already accepted us more. We do not believe that the plural movement is one that is purely online. But we do believe that the plural movement is, ironically, often hyper-individualized and even more hyper-digitized. Being in community with other plurals offline is rarely discussed as even being relevant, let alone something that we can and should work towards, even if many say they'd like to see it. Plurals exist in the offline world, and we always have, but do our communities? There seems to be a prevailing attitude that the plural movement and community must remain online and hidden from our local communities until society recognizes and protects us. We find this to be very counterintuitive. Society doesn't progress on its own. In the trans community, for example, we made progress by having meetups and support groups and coming out and asking for our employers and our doctors and our government to recognize us and to support us. That doesn't mean that everyone needs to do every single one of those things, but insisting that we all have to stay on the internet until society is better isn't how society gets better. The only way we can normalize local plural communities is by making local plural communities, not by waiting for permission or for the right time to come along. We often treat plural community like an impossibility, but they do exist, and they have for years, even if regular meetup groups and public local communities are quite scarce. There was a plural caucus at the Philly Trans Wellness Conference back in 2017, and if we're counting support groups, there was a multiple personality disorder support group in Ohio as far back as 1980. If we count the Hearing Voices Network, the number of groups, both past and present, absolutely explodes, though the Hearing Voices Network is not necessarily meant for plural folks specifically. Keep them in mind, though. They're gonna come back later. DMV Plurals, which we run, has been having bi-monthly meetups for 2 years, and we are very glad that we do. We'll get into the benefits, the why, and the how of doing it yourself later, as well as the other ways you can build community to advance the plural movement without doing things that are quite as obviously big or personally risky. But first, we're going to have TW talk about what the risks actually are. Hello, I'm TW Díaz, and I use they, their, and ze, them pronouns. While we are obviously advocates for outness as a force for change and personal benefit, as well as a worthwhile investment of risk and energy, there are risks to being openly plural in any context, and it is important to address them. Evaluating personal risk is extremely important, and while we think the benefits of outness are often massively understated, they must be balanced with the potential for harm. Being out is not always right for everyone, or for every time and place. Environment is a massive portion of what defines personal risk. Folks in unsupportive home environments, regions with explicit pluralphobic or sanist legislation, or intersecting marginalized identities will generally present the highest risk level for being out. For people who need to conceal their plurality from people who they live with, Especially without independent means of transportation, attending plural-specific events can be risky, even when they are at locations with good deniability, such as a library. Situational awareness is also not a skill that everyone has in abundance, and can be quite important if you would like to be out in some places but not others. The ability to evaluate who you should or should not outright mention plurality to is something that often develops slowly, especially when you are at a point where you are so anxious about the prospect that it's hard to discern your panic from a sense of genuine danger. Coming out at your place of education or work, while an excellent way to break the ice on the subject of plurality, is also often quite risky. Unlike random craft meets, it is significantly harder to recoup your losses if coming out as plural goes poorly while you're working on your thesis, or if your boss reacts negatively to the news. We found being out in our community college to everyone who speaks English has gone quite well, but we deliberately did not disclose our plurality to a psychology professor solely because we did not trust her not to hold stigma. Even when tangible danger is not a concern, though, misunderstanding almost always is. Among plural people who are out, it is a nearly universal experience to have had to navigate others' confusion. This particular risk doesn't loom quite as large when it comes to running or attending a plural-specific meetup, as attendees will by design generally have a plural identity, or at least a concept of it, but it is almost guaranteed outside of plural spaces. Being openly plural in an environment where people usually are not will take some explaining. In our experience, explaining it has not been particularly difficult, but we have also had the advantage of explaining it in English to people for whom English is their first language, who are often vaguely familiar with the idea or plurality, or who are members of subcultures that make them more likely to understand unusual experiences of identity, such as members of a queer student union. It is worth noting, though, that about as often as we've had to push through frustrating misunderstandings, we've often encountered people who also get it immediately, or who were plural themselves and not open about it. It is also quite important when joining or forming local plural spaces to be aware that by virtue of them being location-based, they make your area identifiable. Everyone and their mother knows that we live somewhere around DC, Maryland, and Virginia because we run a group named DMV Plurals, and that is not a risk-free choice. This can be mitigated somewhat by linking your group less clearly to yourself, such as by making a social media page for the group and not advertising it personally. You can also have meetups be exclusively in person with no virtual component, so people who are not in your area are not able to identify your presence there by sneaking into an online server or group chat. But there are also risks for attendees who are going to an event that is in person and run by an unidentified stranger. And there are, of course, risks to building in-person and local communities, both broad and personal. Being out as plural is far from risk-free. But we would also like to challenge the idea that being extensively closeted and having your only plural community be distant and online is inherently risk-free too, and that the potential benefits are infinitely outweighed by the dangers. Sometimes the risks are worth it, and one cannot evaluate whether they are accurately while refusing to consider what the benefits might even be. Being out in person is not the only thing that carries risk, even though it is often implied to be the case. While being out online is less risky in many ways, it is possible to be anonymous, to block people who are hostile, to delete posts and accounts, it also opens one up to significantly more discourse and hostility than interacting with people in person does. For one, it is a lot easier to create new profiles to anonymously harass somebody on Tumblr than it is to make elaborate disguises to harass someone anonymously at an in-person meetup. It is also a known fact that people are often crueler and struggle more to empathize online than they do face-to-face, especially in places with aggressive social norms, such as, but not only, the site formerly known as Twitter. Online plural communities can be quite a cage fight, and despite the low sample size, it seems that in-person plural communities are significantly less so, which also lines up with the difference between online and in-person queer communities, for example, which there are significantly more of for us to compare. It is also far easier to take away disconnected groups of internet users than it is to destroy a network of people in the same area who know each other's faces. The internet is ephemeral by nature, and in the case of censorship or trolling, it is often significantly harder to rebuild online spaces. There are also simply a lot of disadvantages to not being openly plural anywhere to anyone. For many, it takes an enormous amount of effort to conceal plurality. It can be quite difficult to form close relationships when you cannot share something so vital about yourself. In some cases, not even being able to disclose that you exist as a person. So, with that in mind, what are the specific benefits of building local community? I'm Riley. My pronouns are they, them, and any pronoun except for it, and I am here to get into that. For starters, there is support that a local community can offer that a purely online one that's scattered across the entire world just can't. In just our own group, it's possible for people to share resources of all kinds because we all have experience living within our area. If a person needs help finding a healthcare provider who is trans friendly or a therapist who is DID informed, they can ask, and someone is likely to know of an option that is near them. The most common theme we've seen in the opinions of members of DMV Plurals is that it helps to know you're not alone. Even for members who had been highly invested in online plural communities before encountering ours, there was affirmation in knowing that there were plural folks in their area. It can make it feel more real, make being out seem more possible, make being in the closet more bearable. People voiced being comforted just by seeing a DMV Plurals flyer. People who never expect to attend a meetup have said that they feel extremely happy just knowing that they exist. And people who have come to meetups have expressed relief at being in a physical space where they don't have to mask more times than we could count on our hands. For a demographic that is often never alone, plural people tend to feel really, really isolated. And part of that isolation, in our opinion, comes from the plural community mostly existing as decentralized and depersonalized online spaces and posts. This is not to say that the internet isn't real life or that online relationships are less valuable, but the internet is not in person, and engaging with the community only online can contribute to a feeling of unreality to the sense that they don't exist outside of the internet. Other plurals are a vague, distant entity, one whose faces you'll often never see, and who you can never expect to encounter through anything but a computer screen. And that illusion shatters the moment you meet an openly plural person, the moment you see a flyer for a meetup, and the moment you join a server for local plurals. Anytime you're reminded that we are outside. If you want to change that sense, and if you feel ready to try, there is a lot that you can do. And you don't have to start by running a meetup. You don't even have to start by running a Discord server. And I mean, actually, if neither of those seem to be in your skill set, they probably aren't the places to start. For example, if you have no experience with going to meetups of any kind where you are, you're probably going to want to do that first before you start your own, even if that just means going to a craft meet. If there's a Hearing Voices Network chapter that meets near you, it might be worth checking them out. By virtue of being an organization for people who hear voices or have other similar perceptual experiences, they are quite open to the concept of having other entities in your body who communicate with you. You can join local groups in person or online for other things. Trans community spaces especially tend to be pretty full of closeted or potentially unaware plural folks, for example. Just existing as a plural person in your local community in in-person spaces is a massive step towards creating a local plural community. We would argue that it's the very first step before anything else. Often, all it takes to find plural folks is just for someone to break the ice first. introducing yourself by your system name in a chill, unrelated group, announcing fronters at a game night, wearing a Plural Pride merch to the library, or casually mentioning it to a classmate or colleague are all doing plenty. A plural community doesn't have to be a named group. Being in community with each other is much more important than just having named meetups. When we say local plural community, we don't just mean named spaces or meetups or servers. We mean groups of people who are in the same general area, who are plural or supportive, and who know each other. Our local plural community is DMV Plurals, of course, but it's also the handful of plural people that we met at college who we text and study with. It's the people Crow meets in hiking groups who have plural friends or partners who are questioning themselves. It's the other system at TW Synagogue. It's the friend I made in our ceramics class who isn't plural, but always checks who's fronting and is really excited to learn anything about how we think we work. We're just as proud of the informal network we built by being openly ourselves as we are of the community we built by organizing events. Both matter very, very, very much. Named communities are flashier, personal relationships are stronger. Of course, if you want to organize a plural meetup and you think you have a good enough feel for your local area to make one, we certainly encourage it, and we'd like to help you do it. So with that, let's get into the issue of maintaining safety in community groups and meetups, both for yourself and for others. First, it is very important to trust your gut. If a group, situation, or person seems suspicious, listen to that feeling. This goes for any time you're meeting folks you don't know well anywhere, for any reason. Especially for people with complex trauma histories, it can be hard to trust your instincts, but it is very important. And it's important to trust your headmate's instincts too. It is much better to realize the situation was not dangerous in hindsight than it is to regret not trusting your gut feeling that it was. Second, meeting locations need to be public or semi-public and as accessible as possible. This means cafes, libraries, public parks, absolutely no houses. Never go to a stranger's house and never invite them to yours. Address sharing is one of the riskiest things you can possibly do, with virtually no upsides. Third, promote sharing information from reliable sources only or from individuals' lived experience, and avoid conflating either one with the other. It is important to strike a balance between combating pseudoscience and shutting down people for having personal experiences that are outside of the norm or that do not align with known scientific consensus. For example, if people are making claims about how dissociative identity disorder works overall, it is important that what they say is verifiable and ideally has a specific, reputable source. Misinformation spreads incredibly quickly in general, and is quite prominent in plural communities as well. If a claim is scientific, it needs scientific backing. This is how I experienced DID does not need a source, but this is how DID works for everyone certainly does. However, people also need to be able to describe personal experiences that might not have scientific backing, especially given how many plural experiences have simply never been studied. Just like it's inappropriate for folks to treat their personal experiences like they are the science, it is also inappropriate to force the science on people who find it unproductive to their framing of themselves personally. It's possible to oppose pseudoscience without rejecting people whose personal experiences don't line up with the current research. Spiritual, religious, non-medical, and otherwise unstudied or unconventional plural people are integral to the community, and their exclusion does massive harm to everyone. Even people with DID will often have experiences or explanations that fall outside of the expectations of research. This is not just a non-DID issue, it is an issue for all plural people, and it is very important to be inclusive of a broad range of experiences, rather than letting the medical establishment define how we can experience our own identities. Fourth, Be aware that plural groups and individual collectives alike are prone to being targeted by bad actors. Keep an eye out for this, especially for folks who routinely overstep boundaries, engage in fake claiming behavior, or behave abusively or inappropriately to other members, especially to people who may be vulnerable, such as young or newly discovered systems. And it is very important to be cautious with what you disclose. Keep in mind that the internet is often forever, people can act in bad faith, and don't share information that would be dangerous in the hands of a bad actor with people you don't know well, personally, and trust. Fifth, it is extremely important to have firm boundaries about disclosing personal information, both about oneself and others in the group. An obvious version of this is the Vegas rule. What happens in the group stays in the group. Disclosing any information about members of the group, including whether someone is plural or participating in it at all, should be forbidden for the sake of all involved, especially for people who may not be out. Having firm boundaries about disclosure also means not allowing people to share highly sensitive information about their own systems, such as disclosing individual front triggers, trauma triggers, or which of their members are highly vulnerable. Some people may be able to share this information publicly without risk to themselves, or may believe that they can, but it is a dangerous precedent to set to allow people to publicly disclose information like that. Making elaborate trigger blacklists, especially ones sourced from members' individual triggers, can also make a space both inaccessible to people who struggle with memory and highly vulnerable to bad actors. On the note of firm boundaries around disclosing personal information, while it may be very tempting to require people to provide proof of age or location, we could not recommend this less. Never expect a stranger to send you any portion of their address or government ID, and never send either of those to anyone over the internet. Expecting people to send photos of their face is equally inappropriate. Even if you are the most trustworthy person on the entire planet, and even if the information is heavily redacted, odds are you are not having things sent over a highly secure platform to a highly secured device and cannot guarantee that everyone will have things properly redacted. There is very little benefit to requiring this form of verification, and a very significant amount of violation and risk. Finally, if you are facilitating, play to your strengths and expertise and do not ignore your weaknesses. If you're highly conflict avoidant or conflict prone, you probably do not want to run something like a Discord server where you are likely to need to mediate conflict. If you're chronically late or struggle to keep appointments, you probably don't want to run an in-person meetup where it's important that you be there. It's okay to wait until you have people who can help you, or have developed the necessary skills for what you want to do. There is no rush, and running specific named groups is not the end-all be-all of a community. We also would like to make a distinction between support groups and community groups. Support groups are, as the name suggests, groups designed to provide some amount of support. Their focus is sharing struggles, coping skills, and resources. They are generally much more exclusive, are often moderated by counselors or psychologists, and require a higher degree of privacy for the safety of people involved. Community groups, meanwhile, may include aspects of support, but are not focused on it. Their primary aim is providing a space where people can be their authentic selves, not in helping people individually navigate struggle. If you are not in some way trained to run a support group, we do not recommend trying to run a support group. They are harder to facilitate in a lot of ways, and mistakes are higher risk in a space where people are explicitly and consistently seeking support for personal issues. They may require a higher barrier to entry, or need to be hosted in a location that is less publicly accessible than a library or a coffee shop. They also make it harder to be inclusive, especially as people who are not actively suffering from their plurality may begin to feel less entitled to the space, which is the thing that we are trying to avoid. Instead, we strongly recommend aiming for a community space that is also supportive. Your goal is bringing plural folks together in a neutral environment that allows them to meet other people like them and be their authentic selves, while also maintaining a sense of personal responsibility for members protecting their safety and privacy, and not putting anyone in a position where they feel responsible for the well-being of another group member. One of our biggest blunders in that regard was including vent channels in our group's server, which we very much do not recommend doing. It worked all right when the group was less than a dozen people who we knew personally, but it became progressively less feasible, less productive, and less safe as time went on. People felt obligated to care for people who were often strangers to them, felt rejected if they were not responded to, and often disclosed very vulnerable information that we quickly realized we could not ensure would not fall into the wrong hands. Venting and seeking emotional support is generally best done in small, private, and personal groups, or, at the very least, well-vetted ones run by support experts. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's talk about how you actually run a meetup or local community group. We'll be focusing on in-person meetups and events, but a lot of this can apply to things like Facebook groups or Discord servers where you aren't necessarily going to be in a physical space. The first step is, of course, identifying a place for you to meet. This must be a public place for the safety of yourself and of attendees. Absolutely no houses, ever. Libraries are a quite good space to use, since many will have meeting rooms that can be booked for meetups, they're free to be in, and they tend to be in reasonably accessible locations. Cafes also work. For the first year of DMV Plurals life, we met in an all-ages queer bar, though we would generally discourage using locations that are particularly noisy or serve alcohol for accessibility purposes. Being accessible by public transit is a huge boon if you can manage it, especially for folks who might not be in supportive home environments or who just don't have easy access to personal transportation. If you want to have your meetup be a regular occurrence on a set schedule, try to pick a place that will work rain or shine and that you'll have consistent access to. If you're starting out with a one-off meetup, which we do recommend, you can be a lot more flexible. For example, DMV Plurals meets monthly at a library because it's a location that works regardless of weather. However, for our Plural Pride Day meetups, including the very first event we ever had, we meet in public outdoor locations like a botanical garden or the National Mall. When creating an online space for a local community, it is very important to consider your platform. We personally use Discord since it has the advantage of including accessibility tool PluralKit, the ability to spoiler tag or hide potentially distressing text and messages, voice channels that we can use to hold virtual meetups, and ways to verify members. Historically, online groups have existed through mailing lists, forums, and blog sites, though these formats are significantly less popular now and not ones that we can really recommend. Local groups for various things also exist on Facebook, though that's less popular with younger people and offers less tools. You may also find that a specific platform makes more sense for your region or demographic. We only know our experience as quite young English-speaking Americans, after all. For online spaces like Discord servers, we strongly recommend having some form of verification process for new members. For DMV Plurals, we require people joining to submit a form with their preferred alias, age, state of residence, the reason they're interested in joining, and how they learned about DMV Plurals. We also encourage but do not require that people say if they know anyone currently in the group and link a social media profile to make it easier for us to verify their legitimacy. While this obviously operates on the honor system, it provides a layer of privacy and protection, and also makes the server an inconvenient target for trolls. We also cannot recommend strongly enough that when creating a local plural space, you never, ever, ever gatekeep specific experiences of plurality. Diversity is what makes a community strong, and even ignoring that fact, expecting people to disclose both their location and their diagnosis or trauma history is a prohibitively high barrier to entry for people concerned with their privacy or who may be questioning. The history of gatekeeping plural communities to just people with DID is a long and ugly one, and has been deliberately used to divide the community and push unwanted treatments on dissociative patients. That's not a legacy we need to continue in our own community spaces. Allowing the medical establishment to decide who we should include in our communities and subcultures will always end up weakening them. The difference between people with dissociative disorders and other kinds of plurals are not so massive that we cannot share any spaces, nor so clear-cut that enforcing that distinction is always possible. The group we run allows anyone who identifies as plural, dissociative, or questioning to participate, as well as singlets who are directly invited by plural members. This helps maintain a plural-centric space without forcing anyone to prove their validity, and has been effective at that for the past 2 years, now almost 3. One of the things that members of DMV Plurals have most consistently mentioned as an upside of the group is this inclusiveness, and it's no wonder. Instead of agonizing about being deserving of the space, folks can focus on getting the most out of it. The diversity of experiences present in the space lets people find others who are like them, as well as learning from and about folks with other experiences of plurality, both of which are just as important. We know that the idea of moving offline as plural people is intimidating, to say the least. There are a lot of risks, and in a lot of ways, it's kind of just uncharted territory. Plural people have been meeting up in some way for decades, but there probably aren't formal groups where you live yet, and it's likely that you don't currently know any openly plural people. In the end, though, the only way to change that is to just try. If you feel ready to try, there is a lot that you can do. You don't have to start with meetups, you don't have to start with Discord servers, you don't have to start with the big obvious stuff. Just find your strengths, get to work, build your community the way that feels right. Like we've said, we run DMV Plurals, and we're really passionate about helping people organize similar groups if they want to, or just build community in other, potentially more informal ways if they don't. We are currently building a spreadsheet of in-person plural spaces, and if you're interested in finding or making one, we encourage you to check it out. There will be a link popping up on screen right now, just that you can plug in to check on it, and it should also be in the description box if this is on YouTube. We'll also be here for a Q&A after this session is finished. Thank you all so much for being here, and we'll see you around.